Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a faraway kingdom, lived a king and a queen. They lived in silk and velvet, possessing immense wealth and ruling over a peaceful land with happy subjects. Yet, despite having all the gold and treasures in the world, they carried a deep sorrow in their hearts that nothing could fill. They had no children. Every day the queen would sigh, looking out into the royal gardens, and whisper a wish. If only I had a child, even if it were as small as a thumb, I would be the happiest woman alive. But months passed, years passed, and the wish remained unfulfilled. Then one day, as the queen was bathing in a cool spring behind the palace, a frog skipped out of the water onto a lotus leaf and spoke to her. "Your Majesty, your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has passed, you shall bring a daughter into the world." The frog's prophecy came true. Exactly a year later, the queen gave birth to a baby girl. The little princess was so beautiful that the king could not hold back his tears of joy. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her eyes shone like stars. The king decided to hold a feast more magnificent than any before to celebrate this momentous event. The guests included not only relatives and high ministers, but also the wise women, the fairies who held the magical powers of the kingdom. There were 13 wise women in the realm, but the king had only prepared 12 golden plates for the feast. Therefore, he was forced to leave out the 13th wise woman, a recluse known for her volatile temper. The feast was celebrated with all splendor. Candlelight reflected off crystal goblets, and melodious music blended with joyous laughter. As the feast drew to an end, the wise women stepped forward to the cradle to bestow their wondrous gifts upon the child. The first said, "I grant you beauty that will rival the sun." The second continued, "I grant you the wisdom and clarity of the greatest sages." The third smiled, "I grant you a kind heart and perfect virtue." And so it went, granting the princess a voice like a nightingale, grace, musical talent, and everything good in the world. Just as the 11th wise woman had finished her blessing, suddenly the great doors of the palace flew open with a loud crash. A cold wind rushed in, snuffing out the candles, and the hall turned gloomy. The 13th wise woman strode in. She was furious for not being invited. Without greeting anyone, without looking at a soul, she marched straight to the center of the hall, pointed a bony finger at the golden cradle, and cried out with a voice cold as ice, "The king did not invite me, so here is my gift for your daughter. In her 15th year, the princess shall prick herself with a spindle and fall down dead." Having spoken, she let out a cruel laugh, spun around, and vanished into a cloud of black smoke, leaving shock and terror to swallow the palace. The queen wept bitterly, and the king stood frozen in horror. At that moment, the 12th wise woman, the only one who had not yet spoken, stepped forward gently. Because she could not undo the evil curse, but only soften it, she declared clearly, "King and queen, do not despair. The princess shall not die. She shall only fall into a deep sleep that will last for 100 years. Though somewhat comforted, the king, wishing to protect his dear child from any misfortune, immediately issued a command to confiscate and burn every spinning wheel in the entire kingdom. Anyone found keeping a spinning wheel would be severely punished. Time flew by. The blessings of the wise women all came to pass. The princess grew up to be a maiden so beautiful, modest, good-natured, and wise that everyone who saw her loved her. Her beauty and virtue made people gradually forget the old curse. On the very day the princess turned 15, the king and queen had to leave the palace, leaving her alone in the vast castle. Curious and eager to explore, the princess wandered everywhere. She walked through long corridors and opened doors to rooms she had never entered before. Finally, she came to an old tower in the farthest corner of the castle. She saw a narrow, winding staircase leading up. "What is up there?" she wondered, and began to climb. At the top of the tower, she found a small wooden door with a rusty key in the lock. When she turned the key, the door sprang open. Inside the small, dusty room sat an old woman busily spinning flax at her wheel. The wheel made a strange whir, whir sound. The princess, surprised, stepped closer and asked, "Good day, grandmother. What are you doing there?" The old woman, who likely did not know of the king's command, or perhaps was the wicked fairy in disguise, nodded and replied, "I am spinning, my dear child." The princess looked at the strange object with delight. "What is that thing that rattles round so merrily? May I try it?" But alas, no sooner had she touched the spindle than the magic spell was fulfilled. The sharp point of the spindle pricked her finger. Only a single drop of blood appeared, and instantly the princess fell back onto the old bed standing nearby and sank into a deep sleep. And strangely, this sleep did not fall upon her alone. It spread like an invisible wave throughout the castle. The king and queen, who had just returned and entered the great hall, fell asleep on their thrones. The court ministers and the guards fell asleep where they stood. In the stables, the horses stopped chewing hay and fell asleep. The dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, and even the flies on the wall sat still. Even the fire flickering in the hearth stopped moving, and the roasting meat stopped sizzling. The wind ceased, and on the trees in front of the castle, not a leaf stirred. Everything sank into the absolute silence of an eternal slumber. Over time, a hedge of thorns began to grow around the castle. Every year, it grew higher and thicker until it covered the windows and finally grew over the top of the highest tower, so that the castle could no longer be seen. The legend of the beautiful, sleeping beauty spread throughout the land. Many princes from neighboring kingdoms heard the tale and came, trying to force their way through the hedge to save her. But alas, the thorns seemed alive. They held fast together like strong hands, catching the young men so they could not pull free. Many young men perished there, their dreams unfulfilled. 100 long years passed. One fine day, a prince from a distant land traveled through the country. He heard an old man tell the story of the mysterious castle behind the hedge of thorns, where a beautiful princess and her whole kingdom had been sleeping for a century. The old man also spoke of those who had gone and never returned. The prince listened, and instead of fear, he felt a fierce determination in his heart. He said, "I am not afraid. I will go through the thorns to find the sleeping beauty." Despite the old man's warnings, he walked alone toward the giant hedge. And a miracle occurred. Today was the very day the 100 years were over. As the prince approached, the terrifying, sharp thorns turned into large, beautiful flowers. They parted of their own accord to let him pass unhurt, and then closed again behind him to protect the sanctity of the castle. The prince entered the courtyard. A silence so deep it was almost frightening covered everything. He saw the horses and the spotted hunting dogs lying fast asleep. On the roof, the pigeons still had their heads tucked under their wings. Entering the palace, he saw the flies sleeping on the wall, the cook still holding up his hand as if to strike the kitchen boy, and the maid sitting with the black chicken she was about to pluck. He walked through the great hall and saw the king and queen sleeping on their thrones. The silence was so profound that he could hear his own breathing. Finally, he found the way to the tower. He opened the small wooden door, and there before him lay the princess, sleeping. She was so magnificent, her cheeks still rosy, her beauty so divine that the prince stood transfixed, unable to blink. Overcome with emotion, the prince knelt beside her, bent down, and gave her a gentle kiss on the lips. The moment the kiss was given, the 100-year spell was broken. The princess opened her eyes slowly. Her eyes, bright as stars, looked at the stranger with warmth and wonder. She smiled, and her smile lit up the gloomy room. The prince helped her rise. Together, they walked down the stairs. And at that moment, the magic spread everywhere. The king and queen woke up and looked at each other in amazement. The ministers rubbed their eyes and stood up. The horses in the stable stood up and shook themselves. The dogs wagged their tails and barked. The pigeons on the roof pulled their heads from their wings and flew into the blue sky. In the kitchen, the fire flared up. The cook gave the kitchen boy a resounding slap on the ear, making him cry out, and the maid finished plucking the chicken. All activity returned to life, bustling and noisy, as if the 100-year sleep had been but the blink of an eye. Conclusion. Happily ever after. Not long after, the grandest wedding the world had ever seen was held. The prince and princess held hands as they walked down the aisle amidst the cheers of the people. They lived together in happiness for the rest of their lives, ruling the kingdom in peace and prosperity, leaving behind a beautiful story of love to be told forevermore. And that, my dear friends, is the story of Sleeping Beauty. Proof that true love and courage can awaken even the longest dreams and conquer the darkest curses.